Ethan placed his briefcase on the polished mahogany console table, the soft click of the latches echoing in the cavernous, silent foyer. The air in the house he shared with his wife, Amelia, always felt different after a visit to her parents. Thicker, colder, freighted with unspoken judgments. He loosened his tie, the knot feeling more like a noose than a professional necessity. Amelia was already in the living room, the pale, ethereal light of her laptop casting a cool glow on her face, her features drawn, intense. She didn't look up when he entered. He knew she was replaying the evening, just as he was. The casual barbs from her father, Marcus, the condescending pity from her mother, Eleanor, the sneering superiority of her brother, Julian. And through it all, Amelia's suffocating silence. He stood there for a long moment, watching the woman he had promised his life to. He saw not a partner, but a gatekeeper to a family he could never truly join. A family that measured a man's worth in stock tickers and country club memberships, finding his own value, the quiet dedication to his craft, the integrity of his work as a senior architect, wanting. He had endured it for years, believing his love for Amelia was a bridge that could eventually span the chasm of their disdain. But bridges need anchors on both sides. His was set in bedrock. Hers, he was beginning to fear, was set in sand. Tonight he would find out. He would light a match in the dark and see who, or what, it illuminated. He walked over to the bar cart, the crystal decanters gleaming under a single recessed light. He didn't pour a drink. He just needed to be doing something with his hands. He took a slow, steadying breath, the kind an actor takes before walking onto a stage. The performance of his life was about to begin. "Amelia," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a carefully prepared statement. She looked up, her eyes blinking, adjusting from the screen's glare. "Ethan, you were so quiet. Is everything okay? You barely said a word on the drive home." Her concern was a flawless veneer. He could see the cracks in it, the faint lines of annoyance at having her digital solitude disturbed. "No," he said, turning to face her fully. He let the single word hang in the air, heavy and ominous. He held her gaze, forcing her to be present in this moment with him. "Something's happened. At work." Her posture shifted instantly. The mention of his work, the firm owned by her family, was always a trigger. It was the source of his perceived inadequacy, the stage for her brother's undeserved promotions, the constant, grinding reminder of his place in their world. "What is it? Did Julian say something again? I told you not to let him get to you." "It's not Julian," Ethan said, shaking his head slowly. He walked closer, stopping a few feet from her armchair. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial register. "It's bigger than that, much bigger." He let the silence stretch, watching her mind race, her brow furrowing. He had her full attention now. The bait was in the water. "Ethan, you're scaring me. Just tell me." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of manufactured distress. "I'm being investigated," he said, the words precise and devastating. "For financial misconduct. Fraud, Amelia." He watched the cascade of emotions on her face. First, a flicker of shock, then a carefully constructed mask of wifely concern. "What? That's impossible. You wouldn't—" "Who is investigating you? This has to be a mistake." But beneath the performance, deep in her eyes, he saw it. A cold, swift calculation. A flicker not of fear for him, but of fear for herself. It was the look of someone watching a ship sink and already searching for the nearest lifeboat. He had seen all he needed to see, but the play had to continue. He had built the stage for this tragedy, and he would see it through to the final act. What he couldn't have known was just how thoroughly her actions that night, guided by the silent blue glow of her laptop, would write the script for him, unraveling a dynasty and revealing the hollow core of the woman he thought he knew. Have you ever had a moment like that? A single, quiet instant where you knew, with absolute and terrifying certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We see you from London to Los Angeles, from Manila to Mumbai. Now let's get back to the story. The investigation was a lie, of course, a phantom conjured from years of quiet observation and simmering indignity. The real story had begun long before, in rooms just like this one, filled with the same suffocating privilege. Just 2 nights prior, at the Thorne family's Sunday dinner, the humiliation had been particularly acute. The dining room was a monument to Marcus Thorne's ego. A long, polished table that could seat 20, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and a chandelier that dripped crystals like frozen tears. "Ethan," Marcus had boomed, swirling a blood-red Bordeaux in a glass the size of a small fishbowl. "I see the Henderson Tower project is still stalled in committee. Julian tells me there are design complications." Ethan kept his expression neutral, carefully cutting his filet mignon. "There are no complications, Marcus. We're navigating the city's new environmental impact regulations. It's a methodical process." Julian, sitting opposite him, smirked. "Methodical or slow, Ethan? In this business, time is money. Dad, I've already drafted an alternative proposal that bypasses most of the green lighting nonsense. It's more aggressive, more profitable." Eleanor Thorne, a woman who seemed sculpted from ice, gave a small, approving nod. "Julian always sees the big picture. He has your vision, Marcus." Ethan felt Amelia's knee brush against his under the table, a gesture that could have been comfort but felt more like a warning. Don't engage. Don't make a scene. So he said nothing. He didn't mention that Julian's aggressive proposal was a reckless gamble that ignored zoning laws and would likely mire the project in years of litigation. He didn't mention that Julian had simply taken Ethan's own preliminary sketches, stripped them of their innovative, sustainable features, and called them his own. He just ate his steak, the metallic taste of blood and resentment mingling in his mouth. Later, as they were leaving, Marcus had clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture not of affection, but of possession. "Don't you worry, son. Julian will get the Henderson project across the finish line. Every team needs its workhorses, after all." Workhorse. The word hung in the air of the car on the drive home. Amelia had turned up the volume on the classical music station, filling the silence with a frantic string quartet, a soundtrack to their shared avoidance. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He looked at his wife, her profile illuminated by passing streetlights. He had loved her for her grace, her intelligence, the quiet moments of tenderness they shared away from her family's corrosive influence. But he was realizing those moments were becoming islands in an ever-rising sea of compromise. She had chosen to live on those islands, while he was left to drown. That was the night he decided to stop treading water. Now, back in their living room, the lie of the investigation hung between them. "I don't understand," Amelia said, her voice a little too high. "Fraud? What could you have possibly done?" The accusation was already there, thinly veiled. Not, "How can we fight this?" but, "What did you do?" "They're claiming I misallocated funds on the Westgate Galleria project from 3 years ago," Ethan said, inventing details with practiced ease. "That I colluded with a subcontractor. It's insane." "Westgate?" Amelia's eyes went distant. "That was before we were married." A flicker of relief. He saw it. She was already drawing a line, demarcating the boundaries of her potential liability. "Yes," Ethan said softly. "It was." He feigned exhaustion, rubbing his temples. I'm going to head to bed. My lawyer said to get some rest. We're meeting first thing in the morning." He didn't have a lawyer for this, but he did have a meeting, just not the one she would imagine. "Of course," she said, her voice softening into a parody of sympathy. "Try not to worry. I'm sure it will all be cleared up." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. Her skin was cool. "Good night, Amelia." "Good night, Ethan." He walked up the sweeping staircase, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the quiet house. He went into their bedroom, took off his clothes, and got into bed. He didn't turn on the light. He lay on his side facing the door and waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. He heard the faint, muffled sounds of the television downstairs, then silence. Then, the soft creak of the floorboards as she ascended the stairs. She paused outside their door, and he held his breath. She moved on, toward the guest room that doubled as her home office. A moment later, a thin sliver of light appeared under the bedroom door, followed by the soft, almost inaudible click of a laptop being opened. The storm had broken, and Ethan lay in the darkness, listening to the quiet, gathering winds of his wife's betrayal, a silent witness to the beginning of the end. He felt a profound, aching sadness, but beneath it, something else. The cold, hard certainty of a man who finally knows what he has to do. The architect in him saw the truth with brutal clarity. The foundation of his marriage was rotten. It was time to demolish it and build something new. The days that followed were a masterclass in theatrical naturalism. Ethan played the part of the beleaguered husband, while Amelia played the concerned wife. He would leave in the morning, dressed in a somber suit, for his meetings with the lawyer. Amelia would kiss him goodbye, her lips a brief, cool pressure against his cheek, her eyes filled with a carefully rehearsed sympathy that never quite reached them. "Call me if you hear anything," she'd say. "We're in this together." But Ethan knew what she did when he was gone. He knew about the hushed phone calls to her father, the long lunches with her brother. He could picture the conversations, the Thorns huddled together like carrion birds, assessing the potential damage to their name, their reputation, their finances. He imagined Marcus's booming indignation, Eleanor's quiet panic, and Julian's smug satisfaction at Ethan's impending fall. They would see it not as a tragedy, but as a validation of their long-held belief that Ethan was, and always would be, beneath them. The humiliation, which had once been a slow drip poison, now came in a torrent. One afternoon, Ethan came home early to pick up some documents. He walked into the kitchen to find Amelia on the phone, her back to him. "No, Father, I don't know the details," she was saying, her voice tight with frustration. "He's being deliberately vague. Of course I'm being careful. My accounts are separate, you know that. We made sure of that when we got married. Yes, I'll talk to Julian about shielding the firm. The last thing we need is for the Thorn name to be dragged through the mud because of him." Ethan froze in the doorway, the words striking him like physical blows. Because of him. He was no longer a person, but a liability, a stain to be managed. He backed away silently, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He left the house without the documents, the purpose of his return forgotten, replaced by a chilling clarity. He sat in his car for a long time, the engine off, watching the perfect, placid facade of the house they shared. It had never felt less like a home. At the office, the atmosphere was even worse. Julian, emboldened by the rumors he was no doubt spreading himself, treated Ethan with open contempt. He would stroll over to Ethan's desk, flanked by junior architects who looked on with a mixture of fear and sycophantic eagerness. "Still here, Ethan?" Julian asked one morning, leaning against Ethan's drafting table and picking up a finely sharpened pencil. "I'd have thought you'd be busy shredding documents or something." He broke the pencil's lead with a theatrical snap. "Oops, fragile things, aren't they?" The junior architect snickered. Ethan looked up from his schematic, his eyes meeting Julian's. He felt a surge of white-hot anger, a primal urge to rise up and wipe the smirk off his brother-in-law's face. But he crushed it, burying it deep inside. Patience, strategy. He was an architect, after all. He knew that the most enduring structures required the deepest foundations. His foundation was his integrity, and he would not crack it for a moment of fleeting satisfaction. Instead, he calmly took another pencil from his holder. "Some things are, Julian," he said, his voice level. "Others are built to withstand pressure." He turned back to his work, the deliberate movement a dismissal more profound than any insult. Julian, nonplussed at being denied the confrontation he craved, could only sneer. Whatever, just make sure your pressure doesn't splash back on the rest of us. He swaggered away, leaving Ethan in the quiet eye of the office hurricane. Through all this, Ethan clung to his symbolic object, the one thing that was truly his. It was a simple, worn, leather-bound journal. To anyone else, it looked like a sketchbook. Amelia had given it to him years ago, in the early days of their relationship, before her family's influence had fully reasserted itself. "For all your brilliant ideas," she had written on the inside cover. He did fill it with ideas, sketches of buildings that curved like sails in the wind, designs for sustainable community centers, intricate drawings of load-bearing structures. But in the back, behind a false page he had meticulously crafted, was another set of notes. Not architectural designs, but financial ones. A detailed ledger of his true net worth, a fortune inherited from a grandfather who had quietly built a tech empire. A list of shell corporations and holding companies, all managed by a discreet and fiercely loyal team. And most importantly, a step-by-step plan for the acquisition of a controlling interest in a mid-level architectural conglomerate. Apex Design Group, the same group that 2 years prior had bought a majority stake in a smaller, prestigious firm named Thorne and Associates. He would touch the worn leather of the journal throughout the day, its familiar texture a physical anchor in a world that had become unreal. While Julian mocked him, while Amelia plotted her exit, while Marcus prepared to cut him loose, Ethan would feel the smooth cover under his fingertips and remember the truth. They saw a workhorse, a failure, a liability. They were living in a world of appearances, a beautifully decorated house with a rotten frame. He was the architect who knew the building's true structure, and he was the only one who knew the demolition was already scheduled. He deepened the charade, letting slip to Amelia that he might have to sell his car, a modest but well-maintained sedan. "We need to look like we're liquidating assets," he explained, watching her carefully. "Of course," she'd said, her eyes glancing towards the garage where her own brand-new luxury SUV was parked. "You have to do what's necessary." She made no offer to help, no suggestion that we could sell her car instead. The word "we" had become a unilateral term in their marriage. It meant her and her family. It meant her and her assets. It no longer included him. The final piece of humiliation came from Eleanor Thorne. She invited Amelia to lunch at a posh restaurant, explicitly telling her not to bring Ethan. "It's best if you're not seen with him in public right now, dear," she had explained, a fact Amelia had relayed to him with an apologetic shrug. "It's just until this blows over." But the cruelty was in the details. Eleanor had sent Ethan a care package that afternoon. A delivery service dropped off a box containing a single, perfect serving of the restaurant's famous truffle risotto in a plastic container, along with a bottle of expensive water. It was a gesture of such calculated, condescending pity that it took Ethan's breath away. It was a message. This is where we eat. This is what you can no longer have. Here is a taste so you remember what you are losing. Ethan looked at the risotto, its rich aroma filling his small, temporary office, a space he had rented to conduct his real business. He didn't eat it. He left it on the table, a symbol of their arrogance. He opened his leather journal, his sanctuary. He turned to the back, to the plan he had been formulating for months, and with a steady hand he drew a firm, dark line through the final preparatory step. The stage was set. The actors were in place. The quiet preparation was over. It was time for the curtain to rise. The decision to fabricate the investigation wasn't a spontaneous act of desperation. It was a calculated diagnostic tool. For years, Ethan had felt a growing unease, a sense of structural instability in the edifice of his marriage. He was an architect. He understood that before you can fix a problem, you must first understand the full extent of the damage. You have to perform a stress test. You have to find the cracks, the weaknesses, the points of imminent failure. The lie was his seismic charge, designed to send a shockwave through his life and reveal the truth of its composition. He spent the week leading up to it in a state of quiet, intense focus. The world around him seemed to slow down, the colors becoming sharper, the sounds more distinct. It was the calm that settles over a battlefield before the first shot is fired. He moved through his days with a deliberate grace, his outward demeanor a mask of normalcy that concealed the churning maelstrom of his intent. His real work wasn't happening at Thorne and Associates. It was happening in discreet, early morning coffees and late-night video calls. His primary collaborator was Isabel Vance, a woman whose name struck fear into the hearts of corporate litigators across the country. She was sharp, impeccably dressed, and possessed a mind that moved with the cold, beautiful precision of a mechanical watch. She was also the chairwoman of the board of Viridian Holdings, the unassuming name for the company that held the entirety of Ethan's inherited fortune. "Are you certain about this, Ethan?" she had asked him during a meeting in her minimalist, glass-walled office overlooking the city. "There are cleaner ways to handle a corporate restructuring, and a divorce." "It's not just about a restructuring, Isabel," Ethan replied, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "And it's not just about the divorce anymore. It's about truth. For 5 years, I've allowed a false narrative to be written about me. I've been patient. I've been accommodating. I've been the workhorse." He said the word with a quiet bitterness that made Isabel raise an eyebrow. "I need to know, with absolute certainty, that I gave Amelia every chance to prove that narrative wrong. I need to see what she does when she believes I have nothing left." Isabel nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in her dark eyes. "You're not just testing her, you're testing the entire Thorne ideology. Pride, status, appearance over substance. You're setting a trap baited with your own perceived failure." "A trap is a hostile word," Ethan countered softly. "I'd call it a crucible. It doesn't create character, it reveals it." "A crucible, then," she agreed, a faint smile touching her lips. "A very well-designed one. The documents are ready. The final share acquisition from the minority partners in Apex was completed this morning. As of 9:15 a.m., Viridian Holdings has a 75% controlling interest, which means you have a 75% controlling interest. Thorne and Associates is, for all intents and purposes, yours to do with as you please." Ethan felt a tremor run through him, not of excitement, but of immense, crushing weight. The power he had secretly cultivated for years was now fully realized. It was a tool, and like any tool, its moral value would be determined by how he chose to use it. "Thank you, Isabel, for everything." "Don't thank me yet," she said, her expression turning serious. "This will be messy, Ethan. Victories like this are never clean. Be prepared for the fallout." He also observed Julian at work with a new, clinical detachment. He watched as his brother-in-law, puffed up with unearned authority, made a critical error. In his rush to push through his aggressive Henderson Tower proposal, Julian had signed a preliminary agreement with a construction materials supplier that was not only notoriously unreliable, but was also embroiled in a massive price-fixing scandal. He'd been so eager to undercut Ethan's methodical process and impress his father that he had skipped the most basic due diligence. Ethan saw the email confirming the agreement. He saw the flawed contract. He saved a copy to a secure drive and said nothing. Julian was cheerfully and obliviously building his own gallows. The preparation at home was more subtle, more painful. It was in the way he watched Amelia. He noticed the small things, how her eyes would gloss over when he spoke about a design concept he was passionate about, how she would brighten instantly when her phone buzzed with a message from her mother or a friend from her social circle, how she would gently steer any conversation about their future towards things, vacations, renovations, a new car, rather than shared dreams or values. She was a curator of a beautiful life, and he was beginning to feel like just another object in her collection. The night he chose to tell her was no accident. It was the anniversary of their first date. He wondered if she would remember. She didn't. She came home from a charity luncheon, full of stories about the people she had seen and the dresses they had worn. She didn't ask him about his day. He waited until the evening had settled, until the quiet of the house felt less like peace and more like a vacuum. He stood in the living room, the stage he had set in his mind, and delivered the lines he had rehearsed 100 times. Amelia, I'm being investigated for financial misconduct. Fraud, Amelia. Her reaction was a symphony of insincerity. The sharp intake of breath, the hand flying to her mouth, the wide, shocked eyes. It was perfect. It was television. But he saw the truth in the micro-expressions she couldn't hide. The slight narrowing of her pupils, the tightening of her jaw. The mind of a thorn, already assessing risk, calculating exposure, planning a defense, not for him, but for herself. I'm going to head to bed, he said, playing his final card. He needed to give her the space. He needed to be absent, a ghost in their own home, so her true self could emerge. He lay in the dark, his senses on high alert. Every creak of the house was a word in a sentence he was desperate to understand. The sound of her moving to the guest room, the sliver of light, the click of the laptop. It was all exactly as he had pictured it. He feigned sleep, his breathing deep and even, a portrait of a man oblivious to his own betrayal. He waited for 2 hours, a long, silent vigil in the darkness. Finally, he heard the laptop snap shut, the light under the door vanish, and her soft footsteps as she went to her own bed in the master suite. She was choosing to sleep separately, the physical manifestation of the lines she had already drawn between them. He gave it another 30 minutes, then slipped out of bed. The house was utterly still. He padded silently across the hall to the guest room. The air was still warm from the laptop's fan. He opened the device. The screen glowed to life, showing her perfectly organized desktop. He moved the cursor to the web browser icon, his heart pounding, a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He clicked it open, and then he clicked on History. The screen filled with a list, a digital record of a person's priorities in a moment of crisis. The search terms were not questions of support, but of escape. They were not about us, but about me. 10:47 p.m. Consequences of federal fraud investigation for spouse. 10:49 p.m. Can a wife be forced to testify against her husband? 10:55 p.m. How to legally separate assets before a spouse's conviction. 11:03 p.m. Prenuptial agreement enforceability, financial crimes. 11:15 p.m. Top divorce lawyers, high net worth, New York. 11:28 p.m. Julian Thorne, architect, new firm announcement. 11:34 p.m. Thorne and Associates stock price impact of scandal. 11:41 p.m. Selling property jointly owned with person under investigation. Ethan stared at the screen, the cool blue light illuminating the stark, brutal truth. Each line was a nail in the coffin of their marriage. She hadn't searched for criminal defense attorneys for him. She hadn't researched the specific law he was supposedly accused of breaking. She hadn't looked for ways to help or support him. Her first thoughts were of separation, of asset protection, of divorce. She had immediately consulted her father's playbook. Cut the liability, protect the wealth, preserve the name. The search for Julian Thorne, new firm announcement, was the most cutting blow of all. In the midst of her husband's supposed crisis, she was already looking ahead, imagining a future where her brother rose from the ashes of Ethan's career. He felt a strange, hollow calm descend upon him. The architect had completed his stress test. The structure had failed spectacularly. The seismic charge of his lie had revealed not just cracks, but a complete lack of foundational integrity. There was nothing left to salvage. He took out his phone and with a steady hand photographed the screen. the evidence, the truth. Not for a court of law, but for a court of conscience. Her conscience, if she had one, and his own. He closed the laptop, the soft click sounding like a final, irrevocable judgment. He walked back to the guest bedroom he had been sleeping in, no longer feigning anything. The performance was over. The diagnostic was complete. All that was left was the demolition. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan knew exactly what the new structure, the one he would build for himself, was going to look like. The invitation arrived via a crisp, cream-colored email. Marcus and Eleanor Thorne request the pleasure of your company for a dinner celebrating Julian Thorne's appointment to the Henderson Tower project. It was a victory lap, a public coronation, and a deliberate final twist of the knife for Ethan. They weren't just content with his presumed fall. They wanted him there to witness their son's ascent, built directly upon the ruins of Ethan's own hard work and reputation. Amelia presented the invitation to him with an air of strained delicacy. I know the timing is awful, she said, avoiding his eyes, but it would look strange if you didn't come. It would seem like you're admitting guilt. Or it might look like I don't wish to celebrate my own professional assassination, Ethan replied, his voice devoid of heat. Don't be so dramatic, Ethan, she sighed, the mask of sympathy slipping to reveal the familiar Thorne impatience. It's just one dinner. For me, please. For me. The words echoed the hollowness of their union. He looked at her, at the carefully applied makeup, the expensive silk blouse, the faint, troubled line between her brows that was less about his predicament and more about the social inconvenience of it all. Fine, he said, I'll go. He knew this was the stage he had been waiting for, not one of his choosing, but one they had so arrogantly prepared for him. It was perfect. The night of the dinner, the Thorne mansion was ablaze with light, a beacon of self-congratulation in the manicured suburban darkness. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sound of self-satisfied laughter. Marcus was in his element, a magnanimous king holding court, his hand clamped on Julian's shoulder. Julian, for his part, was soaking in the adulation, his chest puffed out, accepting congratulations for a triumph he hadn't earned. Ethan moved through the crowd like a ghost, a specter at the feast. People who had once been friendly now offered him brief, awkward nods before turning away, as if his supposed failure were contagious. He didn't mind. He was an observer, an anthropologist studying the curious rituals of a tribe on the verge of extinction. He held a glass of sparkling water, the cool condensation on his fingers grounding him. In his jacket pocket, his hand rested on his leather journal, his symbolic object, his hidden strength. They sat for dinner at the long, polished table, the same table where he had been called a workhorse. Ethan was seated at the far end, next to a distant cousin who seemed terrified to speak to him. Amelia was seated closer to the center of power, between her father and brother, laughing at one of Julian's jokes. A pang of something, nostalgia, regret, the ghost of love, twisted in his gut. He watched her, so perfectly at home, so radiant in her native environment. She belonged here, in this world of polished surfaces and hollow cores. He never had. The main course was served, and Marcus, tapping a knife against his glass, stood up to make a toast. The room fell silent. Tonight, Marcus began, his voice resonating with pride, we celebrate the future. We celebrate vision, boldness, and the kind of decisive leadership that has always been the hallmark of the Thorne name. He beamed at Julian, who preened under the attention. My son Julian has taken the reins of the Henderson Tower project. He saw a path forward where others saw only obstacles. He cut through the red tape and the bureaucratic hand-wringing to secure a brilliant future for this firm. To Julian! To Julian! The room chorused. Glasses clinked. Amelia looked over at Ethan, a flicker of what might have been pity in her eyes. It was the final condescension he would endure. He waited. He let them finish their toast. He let the applause die down. He let the serving staff clear the plates. He waited until the quiet before the dessert course, the moment of languid satisfaction. Then, he placed his napkin neatly on the table, pushed his chair back, and stood up. Every eye turned to him. A surprised, uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Marcus frowned, a thundercloud gathering on his brow. "Ethan, is there a problem?" "Not a problem, Marcus," Ethan said, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily to every corner of the room. "Just an observation, and perhaps a toast of my own." He picked up his water glass. He looked directly at Marcus. "You once told me, Marcus, that a man's worth is measured by his portfolio. You've built your life on that belief. You've taught it to your children. You've judged me by that standard since the day we met." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "What is the meaning of this, Ethan?" Ethan ignored him, turning his gaze to Eleanor. "Eleanor, you believe that appearances are everything. You sent me a container of risotto last week, a gesture meant to remind me of the world I was losing. It was a powerful statement about what you value: status, exclusion, and the quiet cruelty of pity." He then looked at Julian, whose face was a mask of indignant rage. "Julian, you believe that success is a birthright. You took my designs, stripped them of their integrity, and called them your own. You took credit for my work, and you are being celebrated for it tonight. You believe you are a leader, but you are merely a plagiarist with a powerful father." Finally, his eyes rested on Amelia. The table was frozen. Her face was pale, her smile gone. "And you, Amelia," he said, his voice softening with a genuine, aching sadness. "You believe in self-preservation above all else. You believe that loyalty is conditional and that a partnership is only valid as long as both parties are solvent." A low murmur went through the room. Julian started to rise from his chair. "How dare you?" "I'm not finished," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the noise with an authority no one in that room had ever heard from him before. He held up his hand, and to everyone's surprise, Julian sat back down. Ethan took a slow breath. This was the moment, the quiet bomb. "You are all operating under a series of assumptions," he said, his voice dropping slightly, forcing them to lean in. "You assume I am finished. You assume I am being investigated for fraud. You assume I am weak." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Let me correct the record," he continued. "I am not being investigated for fraud. The story was a test, a crucible, to see what would happen when the foundations were shaken." He looked directly at Amelia, whose eyes widened in horror and dawning comprehension. "As for being finished, that brings me to my toast." He raised his glass. "Marcus, you are correct that a man's worth is often measured by his portfolio. You just, as it turns out, have been reading the wrong man's portfolio." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the leather journal, placing it on the table with a soft, definitive thud. "You celebrate Julian's appointment to the Henderson Tower project tonight, a project managed by Thorne and Associates, a firm owned by the Apex Design Group." He let that hang in the air for a second. "And as of 9:15 a.m. 3 days ago," Ethan said, his voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand, "my company, Viridian Holdings, acquired a 75% controlling interest in Apex Design Group. So I would like to propose a toast, not to Julian, but to my new employees." He swept his gaze across the stunned, silent faces of the Thorne family. "Congratulations on the acquisition. I look forward to working with all of you." The silence that followed was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical entity, a crushing weight that sucked the air from the room. It was the sound of a world ending. Marcus Thorne's face, moments before flushed with pride, had gone a ghastly, mottled white. The wine glass in his hand trembled, a tiny, telltale tremor that betrayed the complete collapse of his composure. Eleanor's hand was at her throat, her perfectly manicured fingers pressing into her skin as if to hold herself together. Julian's jaw was slack, his mouth slightly open. his expression a comical, horrifying blend of confusion and disbelief. And Amelia, her face was a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock. The color had drained from her cheeks, leaving her makeup standing in stark relief. Her eyes were locked on Ethan, wide with a dawning horror that was about more than just money or status. It was the look of someone who has just realized they made a fatal, irreversible, and profoundly stupid mistake. The lie of the investigation, her secret searches, her clandestine calls with her father, it all flashed behind her eyes, recontextualized not as prudent self-preservation, but as a catastrophic act of betrayal against the most powerful man she had ever known. Ethan stood there in the ringing silence, the architect observing the demolition of a structure he had not built, but had finally condemned. He had expected shouting, denial, rage, but the shock was too profound, the reversal too absolute. They were paralyzed. What did you say? Marcus finally stammered, the words barely a whisper. His booming, authoritative voice was gone, replaced by the reedy tone of a frightened old man. I believe I was clear, Marcus, Ethan replied, his voice still calm, still measured. This was the verbal chess match he had prepared for, and he had just delivered checkmate. Viridian Holdings, which I own and control, has acquired Apex Design Group, which means I own and control Thorne and Associates, your company, your name. Julian finally found his voice, a high-pitched, incredulous squawk. That's impossible. You're a senior architect. You drive a 4-year-old sedan. You can't own the company. The protest was so juvenile, so rooted in the superficial metrics they live by, that it was almost pathetic. Yes, I can, Ethan said simply. He opened the leather journal on the table. The assembled guests, who had been frozen in a state of horrified fascination, leaned forward. He didn't show them financial statements or complex charts. He turned to a single page. On it was a clean, elegant architectural sketch of a skyscraper, one far more ambitious and beautiful than the Henderson Tower. Beneath it was a single, authoritative signature, and below that, another. The signatures of the two principal minority partners of Apex, confirming the sale. It was symbolic, of course. The real documents were thick binders in Isabel Vance's office, but the effect was devastating. My grandfather did not believe in ostentatious displays of wealth, Ethan explained to the silent room. He believed real power was something you held, not something you showed. He taught me that a solid foundation is more important than a flashy facade, a lesson I'm afraid that was never taught in this house. The quiet bomb had landed. Now came the shockwave. As if on cue, the grand double doors of the dining room swung open. A woman stepped in, her presence immediately commanding the room's attention. It was Isabel Vance. She was dressed in a severe, elegant black suit, her expression unreadable. She walked with a silent, confident stride directly to Ethan's side. She placed a thin, leather-bound portfolio on the table next to his journal. Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice crisp and cool, addressing Marcus. I am Isabel Vance, chairwoman of the board of Viridian Holdings and acting counsel for the new majority ownership of Apex Design Group. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her authority was absolute. I'm here to deliver the official notice of the change in control and to schedule a transitional board meeting for Monday morning at 9 a.m. Attendance for all current board members, including yourself and Mr. Julian Thorne, is mandatory. The arrival of Isabel was the final, undeniable confirmation. It shattered any lingering hope the Thornes might have had that this was some elaborate, insane bluff. This was real. This was happening. Marcus sank back into his chair, his face ashen. He looked 20 years older than he had 10 minutes ago. My company, he whispered, his eyes unfocused. My company, now, Ethan corrected him, his voice devoid of triumph. It was a simple statement of fact. And on Monday, at that board meeting, our first order of business will be to review the Henderson Tower project. Specifically, the preliminary supply contract Julian signed last week. Julian's head snapped up, a new kind of fear, specific and sharp, entering his eyes. What about it? The one with construct all materials, Ethan continued, his gaze locking onto Julian's. The company currently under federal indictment for price fixing and fraud. The contract you signed without a cancellation clause, potentially exposing this firm to millions in liability and legal fees. The contract you signed because you were in too much of a hurry to do your due diligence. You were too busy taking credit for a project you didn't understand to actually manage it. Julian's face went from indignant to terrified. He had been caught, not just for his arrogance, but for his incompetence. His father, the man who had championed his boldness, now looked at him with dawning horror and contempt. The foundation of Julian's entire life, his father's unconditional approval, was crumbling beneath him. Eleanor began to make a soft, wounded sound, a keening noise in the back of her throat. The party guests, realizing they were witnessing not just a family argument, but a corporate execution, began to quietly excuse themselves, melting away into the night, eager to escape the blast radius. Finally, Amelia spoke. Her voice was trembling, fragile. "Ethan, why?" Ethan turned to her, and for the first time, he let a flicker of his profound disappointment show. "Why?" he repeated softly. He reached into his other jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He swiped the screen and turned it so she could see it. Displayed in the cool, unforgiving light was the photograph he had taken of her laptop screen, the list of her searches. Top divorce lawyers, high net worth, New York. How to legally separate assets before a spouse's conviction. He didn't need to say a word. The screen said everything. Her breath hitched in a sob. She looked from the phone to his face, her eyes pleading, begging him to undo this, to take it back, to somehow make the truth untrue. But the architect had already surveyed the damage. The demolition was complete. The ground was cleared. The silence in the room was the silence of a new, empty beginning. And the Thorns, who had lived their lives in a palace of arrogance, were now sitting in the rubble, staring at the man they had so fatally, profoundly underestimated. The immediate aftermath was a tableau of disintegration. The grand dining room, which had been a stage for triumph, became a courtroom and a funeral parlor all at once. The remaining guests, the sycophants and the true believers in the Thorn dynasty, fled as if from a plague house, their hurried whispers and averted eyes a testament to the brutal social calculus of power. One moment Marcus Thorn was a king, the next he was a pariah. Marcus himself seemed to have shrunk. The bombast and arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind a frail, bewildered man. He stared at the portfolio Isabel Vance had placed on the table, a slim, black leather harbinger of his doom, as if it were a venomous snake. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had built his entire identity on the foundations of wealth and control, and Ethan had just dynamited them both. Julian reacted with impotent fury. "You can't do this," he snarled, finally finding his voice. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the polished floor. "This is our family's company. My grandfather built it." "Your grandfather built a good, respectable firm, Julian," Ethan said, his voice cutting through Julian's anger like a diamond blade through glass. "Your father turned it into a monument to his own ego. And you were about to run it into the ground through sheer incompetence. The contract with Constructall is actionable negligence. You exposed the firm, your father, and every employee to massive risk. Not out of boldness, but out of laziness and pride. The company your grandfather built is safer with me than it ever was with you." Every word was a precisely aimed blow. Julian flinched, his rage collapsing into a sullen, childish pout. He had no defense. The truth was unassailable. Eleanor, meanwhile, had gone from silent shock to quiet, desperate pleading. She rose from her chair and came around the table, her movements stiff. She ignored Ethan. She went straight to Isabel Vance. "Miss Vance," she began, her voice trembling but regaining a sliver of its old imperious tone. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding. This is a family matter. Surely we can discuss this reasonably." Isabel looked at Eleanor with an expression of profound indifference. "Mrs. Thorne," she said, her voice like ice, "I am not here to discuss family matters. I am here on behalf of the new majority owner of this company. My only reasonable discussion will be on Monday morning in the boardroom, if you'll excuse me." With a slight dismissive nod, she turned back to Ethan. "My work here is done for the evening, Ethan. I'll see you on Monday." "Thank you, Isabel," Ethan said. As she walked out, the last vestiges of the Thorns' power seemed to exit with her. They were no longer dealing with their upstart son-in-law. They were dealing with Viridian Holdings. They were dealing with a force they could not comprehend, let alone fight. Now only Amelia was left. She was still staring at the phone in Ethan's hand, at the digital proof of her betrayal. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "Ethan," she whispered, the sound broken. I was scared. I panicked. It didn't mean anything." "It meant everything, Amelia," Ethan said softly, finally putting the phone away. The coldness in his voice was more devastating than any shout could have been. "It meant that when you thought I was at my lowest, your first instinct was not to reach for my hand, but to protect your wallet. It meant our marriage was a contract, not a covenant. You ran the numbers, and you decided I was a bad investment. The irony," he added with a hint of bitterness, "is that you made the worst trade of your life." She flinched as if he had struck her. "I love you," she cried, the words sounding hollow and desperate even to her own ears. "We can fix this. I know we can." Ethan looked at her, and the architect in him saw the flawed design. He saw the beautiful facade she presented to the world, and he saw the crumbling, selfish structure beneath. He had spent years trying to reinforce it, to patch the cracks, to believe it was sound. But the stress test had proven it was unsalvageable. "No, we can't," he said, the finality in his tone leaving no room for argument. "Love doesn't search for divorce lawyers when things get hard, Amelia. It searches for solutions. It shows up. You didn't. You consulted your father and your brother and your bank account. You made your choice. You chose your family. You chose their name. And now you get to live with that choice." He turned to leave. He had said everything he needed to say. The rest would be handled by lawyers and board resolutions. "Ethan, wait!" Marcus called out, his voice cracking. He finally stood, his body stooped. "Son, please, don't do this. The company, it's my life's work. It's my name." Ethan stopped at the doorway but didn't turn around. "Your name," he said, his back still to them. "That's all it ever was to you, wasn't it? A name. Not the people who worked for you, not the buildings you created, just the name on the letterhead. You were so obsessed with your name, you never bothered to learn mine. You never bothered to see the man who was standing right in front of you." He paused, then delivered the final, quiet blow. "As of Monday, the board will be voting on a motion I am putting forward. A motion to rename the firm. Thorne and Associates is a name associated with a culture I intend to dismantle. We're changing it to Crestview Designs." It was the name of the small, two-person firm he had started himself, years ago before he'd met Amelia, before he'd been absorbed into the Thorne machine. A name that meant nothing to them, but everything to him. It was a declaration of independence and a reclamation of his own identity. Without another word, he walked out of the dining room, out of the opulent, suffocating mansion, and into the cool, clean night air. He didn't look back. He could hear a single, sharp, shattering sound from behind him, the sound of Marcus Thorne's wine glass, the one he'd used to toast his son's false victory, finally slipping from his nerveless fingers and breaking into 1,000 pieces on the floor. The days that followed the dinner party were a study in consequences. Power, once lost, does not return. The intricate web of social and professional influence that the Thorns had spent a lifetime weaving dissolved overnight. The phone calls stopped. The invitations dried up. The friends who had flocked to their parties and benefited from their connections now crossed the street to avoid them. The world they had built, a world propped up by the illusion of unassailable status, had vanished, and they were left blinking in the harsh, unfamiliar light of irrelevance. The board meeting on Monday was less a meeting and more a formal sentencing. Ethan, flanked by Isabel Vance and two other board members from Viridian Holdings, sat at the head of the long, polished conference table. Marcus and Julian sat at the far end, isolated and diminished. They had attempted to rally the few remaining minority shareholders, but it was a futile gesture. Ethan's 75% stake was a sledgehammer against which their tiny hammers were useless. Ethan conducted the meeting with a calm, dispassionate efficiency that was more chilling to the Thorns than any emotional outburst would have been. He laid out his vision for the company's future, a renewed focus on sustainable design, a commitment to ethical practices, and a new internal culture based on merit, not nepotism. The first motion, as promised, was the renaming of the firm. All in favor of rebranding Thorn & Associates to Crestview Designs? Ethan asked. 4 hands went up immediately. All opposed? Marcus and Julian raised their hands, a pathetic 2-vote protest against the tide of their own destruction. The motion carries, Ethan announced, his voice flat. He watched as Marcus flinched, the removal of his name a symbolic erasure of his entire professional life. The second motion concerned the Henderson Tower project. Ethan presented the findings of a rapid internal audit he had commissioned over the weekend. It laid Julian's negligence regarding the Construct-All contract, detailing the potential legal and financial exposure. Given the gross mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty demonstrated in the handling of this project, Ethan said, reading from the audit summary, I move for the immediate termination of Julian Thorne's employment for cause. You can't, Julian sputtered, his face red with fury and panic. Dad, say something. Marcus looked at his son, and for the first time there was no pride in his eyes, only a weary, bitter disappointment. He had backed the wrong horse, and he knew it. He said nothing. All in favor? Ethan asked. Again, the 4 hands from the Viridian side went up. Opposed? Julian and Marcus raised their hands. The motion carries. Julian, your access to the building and all company systems will be revoked at the end of this meeting. Security will escort you out. Julian stared at his father, his expression pleading, but Marcus wouldn't meet his gaze. He just stared at the polished surface of the table, at the reflection of a broken man. The son he had championed, the visionary he had celebrated, had proven to be a liability. And in the cold calculus of the world Marcus had created, liabilities were always cut loose. The final piece of business was Marcus himself. Ethan didn't fire him. That, he felt, would be too simple, too clean. Instead, he proposed a new role for the former CEO. The board has created a new, non-executive position, Ethan announced. Chairman Emeritus, a purely advisory role with no operational authority, no staff, and no vote on the board. We offer this position to you, Marcus, in recognition of your years of service. It was a masterstroke of poetic justice. It wasn't a firing, it was a gilded cage. Marcus could keep an office, a smaller one on a lower floor, and a title. He could come to the building his grandfather had founded, but he would have no power. He would be a living ghost, a walking reminder of the old regime, forced to watch as Ethan reshaped his legacy into something new, something better. It was a humiliation far more profound than being cast out. Marcus Thorne, the man who had commanded rooms with a single booming word, looked up at Ethan, his eyes hollow. I accept, he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The consequences rippled outwards. Julian, unemployable in the architectural world due to the nature of his firing, was forced to take a low-level sales job arranged by a distant relative. Eleanor, stripped of her social standing, retreated into the cavernous mansion, the silence of the house a constant reminder of their fall. The Thorn name, once a synonym for power and success, became a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. Ethan, meanwhile, moved with purpose. He promoted talented architects who had been overlooked for years under the Thorn regime. He canceled the predatory contract with Constructall, absorbing the penalty as a necessary cost of cleaning house. He re-engaged with the city on the Henderson Tower project, presenting his original, sustainable design, which was met with enthusiasm. He was not just tearing down, he was building. He was transforming the rotten structure of Thorn and Associates into something strong, ethical, and enduring. He was being the architect he had always known himself to be. He worked long hours, pouring his energy into the firm, now named Crestview Designs. The change was more than just cosmetic. The atmosphere in the office shifted from one of fear and sycophancy to one of collaboration and respect. People were energized, creative, and loyal to the man who judged them on the quality of their work, not the name of their father. Ethan had not sought revenge, he had sought justice. And in the process, he had liberated not only himself, but an entire company of people who had been suffocating under the weight of the Thorns' arrogance. The poetic justice of their downfall was not in their suffering, but in the flourishing of everything they had tried to suppress. A week after the board meeting, Ethan came home to the house he still technically shared with Amelia. He had been staying in a hotel, giving her space, but there were practical matters to attend to. He found her in the living room, surrounded by packing boxes. The house, once a pristine showroom, was in a state of disarray. It was a physical manifestation of their broken marriage. She looked up when he entered. She was pale and had lost weight. The fire and confidence she had always worn like a second skin were gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. "Ethan," she said, her voice quiet, "I'm packing my things. I'll be staying with my parents for a while." "Okay," he said. He felt no anger, no triumph, just a profound, hollow ache. This was the necessary, painful end to a chapter of his life. She stood up, twisting a ring on her finger. "I've been thinking about what you said, about what I did. You were right." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "I was a coward. I was so terrified of losing the life my parents built, the status, the security. I didn't realize I was throwing away the only thing that actually mattered." He said nothing, letting her speak. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a confession. "When I saw my father at that meeting," she continued, her voice trembling, "and I saw him broken, I realized he had lost everything. And I looked at Julian, who is so full of hate and blame for everyone but himself, and my mother, who just wanders the house like a ghost. And I saw my future. That was going to be me. Empty. Alone with a lot of expensive things." She took a shaky breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Ethan. I wouldn't. I don't think I can ever forgive myself. But I needed you to know that I see it. I see it all now." He listened, and for the first time, he believed she was being completely honest. The crucible had worked. It had burned away the artifice, the arrogance, the years of indoctrination, and revealed the person underneath. A person who was flawed and weak, but perhaps, finally, real. He walked over to the console table where his briefcase used to sit. He reached into his own jacket and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it and placed it on the table. It was the printout of her browser history, the moral mirror. "I didn't show you this at the dinner to humiliate you, Amelia," he said softly, his voice full of a sadness that surprised him. "I showed it to you so you would have to see yourself. Not the person your parents wanted you to be, not the person I wanted you to be, the person you were in that moment of crisis." She looked at the paper, at the cold, damning list of searches. She reached out a trembling hand and touched it, as if it were a sacred, terrible relic. "This is who you were," Ethan said. "The question you have to answer now, for yourself, is if this is who you're going to be." A single tear finally escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "No," she whispered. "It's not." He nodded slowly. "I hope so, Amelia, for your sake." He turned to the front door, his hand on the knob. "Ethan, wait," she called out, a note of panic in her voice. "What happens now? To us?" He paused, his back to her. He thought of all the years of silent humiliations, the compromises, the slow erosion of his soul. He thought of the cold calculation in her eyes when he told her his lie. He thought of the man he was becoming now that he was free, focused, creative, and whole. The architect in him knew that some structures are too damaged to be repaired. You can't build a new skyscraper on a cracked and rotten foundation. You have to clear the site and start over. "I've already filed for divorce," he said, the words simple, devastating, and final. "The papers will be delivered to your lawyer tomorrow. I wish you the best, Amelia. I truly do. I hope you find your way." He opened the door and walked out, closing it gently behind him. He didn't slam it. There was no anger left. There was only the quiet, somber work of demolition and the clean, open promise of a new design. He left her there, in the house full of boxes, with the stark, written proof of her betrayal and the difficult, necessary task of rebuilding a life from the wreckage she had made. 6 months later, the city skyline was changing. The skeletal framework of the Henderson Tower, rechristened the Crestview Tower, was rising, its design elegant, innovative, and unapologetically green. It was a physical testament to Ethan's vision, a symbol of the new era at the firm he now led. Crestview Designs was thriving. The office, once a place of quiet tension and simmering resentment, was now a vibrant hub of creativity. Ethan had fostered a culture of collaboration and respect. He mentored young architects, listened to their ideas, and gave credit where it was due. He had lunch in the communal kitchen, not in a private dining club. He remembered people's names. He judged people by the content of their character and the quality of their work. And in return, he earned a fierce loyalty that Marcus Thorne, with all his wealth and power, had never been able to buy. He saw Marcus occasionally. The chairman emeritus still kept his office, a small glass-walled space on the second floor. He would wander the halls of the company that no longer bore his name, a king in exile, a ghost haunting the monument to his own hubris. He looked older, smaller, a man hollowed out by the loss of the only thing he had ever truly valued, his status. Ethan would nod politely when they passed in the hall. He felt no animosity towards the man, only a distant, clinical pity. Marcus was a living embodiment of the lesson Ethan had learned. A life built on appearances is a fragile structure, destined to collapse under the slightest pressure. Ethan never saw Julian again. He heard through the grapevine that he had lost his sales job and was living off a dwindling trust fund, his days filled with bitter complaints and rounds of golf with the few friends who could still tolerate his presence. He was a man trapped in a prison of his own making, forever blaming the world for the consequences of his own arrogance and incompetence. Once, Ethan received a letter from Amelia. It was a simple, handwritten note. She didn't ask for forgiveness or a second chance. She told him that she had moved out of her parents' house and was living in a small apartment downtown. She was taking classes at the local university, studying art history, something she had always wanted to do but had dismissed as impractical. She wrote that she was finally learning to be a person on her own, not just a daughter or a wife. She was building something for herself, she said, from the ground up. She wished him happiness. He read the letter, felt a quiet sense of closure, and wished her the same. Her redemption, if it was to come, would have to be her own project, built on her own terms. One evening, Ethan stood on the balcony of his new apartment, a clean, minimalist space that overlooked the city. He wasn't in the grand house he had shared with Amelia. He had sold it, the proceeds forming the basis of a charitable foundation for architectural scholarships. His new home was smaller, more personal, filled with books and his own sketches. It was a space that reflected him, not a curated image of success. He held the old, worn leather journal in his hands. He no longer needed the secret compartment in the back. Everything was out in the open now. He flipped through the pages, past the financial notes and acquisition plans, to the early sketches. The ideas for buildings that seemed to defy gravity, for public spaces that fostered community, for homes that were in harmony with their environment. These were the things that had always driven him. He had been forced to become a strategist, a corporate raider, a demolition expert, but at his core, he was still an architect. He was a builder. He looked out at the city lights, at the rising silhouette of the Crestview Tower against the twilight sky. He hadn't sought revenge. Revenge is a destructive force, an act of tearing down for its own sake. He had sought truth and justice. He had been forced to tear down a rotten structure, yes, but only so he could build something better, something stronger, something more honest in its place. He had maintained his integrity, his moral high ground. He had not become cruel or petty. He had simply held up a mirror and forced the thorns to see their own reflections. Their downfall was not his victory, but the natural, inevitable consequence of their own character. The true victory was not in their fall, but in his own rise. Not in status or wealth, but in the freedom to be himself, to do the work he loved, and to build a life and a company based on the enduring principles of integrity, merit, and respect. True worth, he now knew with absolute certainty, is not measured by the name on a building or the balance in an account. It is measured by the strength of your foundation and the integrity of your design. What do you think? Was Ethan's methodical plan a brilliant act of justice, or did he go too far? Could he have achieved the same result in a different way? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective is what makes this community so special. And if you found this story of vindication satisfying, please don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of hidden strength, moral clarity, and the quiet triumph of integrity. We appreciate every single one of you watching tonight, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for being here.